Hello,
I'm Beck,
I'm Annie.
and welcome to the Career Coven. This week's episode is on imposter syndrome, one of the topics that was most requested by everyone who we've spoken to. We just got sort of overwhelming amounts of questions about this when we canvassed everyone. So I think one that
Yeah,
we're excited about and also maybe a bit nervous.
yeah, I do have imposter syndrome about talking about imposter syndrome. So, yes, I'm excited. I know I'm going to learn a lot. I have already learned a lot from researching this topic, which has been good, but it was it was definitely the most popular question, wasn't it? So, excited to dig into it, and I think that probably reflects like how common this feeling is.
Yeah, totally. I think the reason you and I have probably perhaps delayed doing this one is almost out of fear of not getting it right. So we
I know what
probably
you
won't.
mean.
We probably won't get it right, and we may not cover everything, but we'll give it a good old crack.
Are you
Um,
teaching us, Beck? Are you teaching us the moral of the story at the start?
Surely not. Surely not. Okay, so shall we start with what imposter syndrome is?
Yes. So I was really surprised by this. So I'm going to say what I thought imposter syndrome was just this like kind of uncomfortable feeling of like I'm not quite like qualified to do this. I didn't actually think it was sort of more than that. And what I found really interesting is like I don't cognitively recognize that like quite a high level version of like, oh, I'm not qualified to do this. I feel like I do things I'm not qualified to do all the time. However, through the research, I learned it's actually a feeling of like fakeness or like feeling like a fraud or feeling like a phony when you are actually like quite a successful person, and that it's linked to success and achievement, and that actually it can show up in all aspects of your life, not just at work, which was, you know, a bit of a surprise to me. I like had not thought about imposter syndrome in the context of friendship or anything like
Mm,
that. Um, but yeah, I guess under I'd like slightly underbaked what I thought it was. I just thought it was like that, oh, I'm not really qualified to do this and I have to do it anyway and I feel a bit uncomfortable. Whereas I was really interested to learn that it's like this chronic feeling almost that you're not good enough, even when you have actually been successful and you probably are like quite good.
yeah,
Um,
I was also really surprised about the correlation between success and imposter syndrome. That's obviously not a causation, but you are probably more likely to feel it if you are successful, and perhaps there is something around that, around your drive. I think the bit that I probably didn't appreciate in enough detail is that so much of imposter syndrome from our reading really comes from a place of really deep seated fear and shame around
mm,
your self worth. And I think that is genuinely a bit different to confidence, and we can come back to it. But it's almost like having a sort of professional anxiety
mm.
constantly about your self worth. And I think what's really important to say is that lots of people have it, and it's normal.
Yeah.
And I think before doing the reading, I probably would have always said I don't have imposter syndrome, which I think doing the reading, I can recognize patterns of when I have demonstrated those behaviors where I could probably pinpoint where I did and wasn't aware of it, which is also quite an interesting learning.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the statistics like on imposter syndrome were sort of crazy high. Like the prevalence of it was anything from 9% to like 82 or 85%, which obviously that range is massive, which maybe suggests that the quality of some of the research in this space is like a bit mixed. But like, anything where you see like an 80, 82 on like a kind of psychological phenomenon, you think like, my God, this is a common thing that people are experiencing, but more common for some people than others, right? And that was another really big kind of take home for me, is that like you can't kind of remove imposter syndrome from like the structures in which we like live and work and like grow up. And I think that all the reading that I did of the kind of research papers suggested that minority groups are more likely to experience imposter syndrome, and that is because of kind of racism, social stigma, microaggressions in the workplace, and kind of structural issues. So I think that's really important to like highlight as well, is that
Yeah.
it's not just about like the person, it's about like the person plus the environment in which they're in, and like their lived experience.
Yeah, and I think for me, that feels like the really big distinction between confidence and imposter syndrome is that imposter syndrome really encapsulates all of the kind of societal pressure and systems and structures that confidence doesn't necessarily have as a kind of underscoring cause, or kind of it doesn't sit in that ecosystem necessarily, whereas I think it does for imposter syndrome. And I think the the person who had come up with imposter syndrome, it was originally created with it being for women, and that it's something that women experience, and then has been expanded out to be sort of agender. It's something that everyone experiences, though I think women are probably still more likely to experience it than men. But I think you're right that it's really important to point out the intersectionality of this. And I haven't been able to find any research on it, but I would imagine that other minorities would have a similarly high index versus non-minorities when looking at this in particular, and that's because of the societal structures around it.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. And that's like fascinating, isn't it? The whole concept was sort of not invented because it's real, but like the whole term, the whole kind of study of it was all to do with women and it being something that women only experience. That almost in my mind, like for some reason, discredits it. But maybe that's like not the way to look at it. But yeah.
I've also heard someone in a different environment talk about how they don't like the use of the word syndrome for imposter syndrome, but I
Yeah.
think we should just use it as it is titled and known in kind of the popular world as imposter
Yeah.
syndrome.
Yeah. Agreed. It makes it sound very, very medical.
Yeah.
And I think that that was also probably one of the reasons that I felt some like discomfort about talking about this, because there is the structural part for sure, and I think that we can totally talk about the interaction between the individual and the workplace, and we will. And but then there is this kind of quite deep rooted personal side of like imposter syndrome and those feelings, and that does almost feel clinical, and that's probably reinforced by that word syndrome. It's like, and it's actually interestingly not a medical diagnosis, you know, like that was all over what we were reading. Is like, this isn't a recognized like medical diagnostic, it's not in the diagnostics and statistics manual or whatever the mental health kind of bible is of diagnoses. So it's not something people recognize as a like treatable condition, but yeah, it is called a syndrome, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I do think that the prevalence of whatever we want to call it, a phenomenon, a kind of common anxiety, whatever we would actually term it as, the fact that it is so pervasive means that we should still talk about it, even though maybe we're not therapists, or I'm not,
Yeah,
not a
exactly.
professional in examining your inner child.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
I'd,
exactly.
I'd love to be an armchair psychologist. Um,
I feel that I already am one of them, you know, like I feel like I'm quite happy to sort of do it from the perspective of like, I've only got a surface level of understanding, but I like to share my opinions quite freely, of
Perfect.
course. But yeah, yeah, I agree. You know, we're not therapists, we're not pretending to be, but something you said earlier was like, you didn't necessarily identify with the label of an imposter syndrome. Me neither. I actually like went through the same journey of like recognizing it through this reading. And I think that when I thought about why I feel it less now than I used to in the past, I did like recognize that like coaching and professional development was part of that journey, but so was therapy for sure. Anyway, we can.
So on this topic, I think you and I both found something really helpful independent of each other, which was a researcher called Dr. Valerie Young who kind of split it out into 5 imposter types. And I think you and I both hit the same eureka moment of this is my flavor.
It's my flavor of imposter syndrome.
Shall we read them out?
Yeah.
So the first one is the perfectionist. This is the one that I've been coached out of, but still
Mm.
have some tendencies towards. But this type of imposter syndrome involves believing that unless you were absolutely perfect, you could have done better. You feel like an imposter because your perfectionistic traits make you believe that you're not as good as others might think you are. The second one is the expert. The expert feels like an imposter because they don't know everything there is to know about a particular subject or topic, or they haven't mastered every step in a process. Because there is more for them to learn, they don't feel as if they've reached the rank of expert. Not something I personally feel, but
No, I was like, oh, that's the expert sounds incredibly exhausting because they are an expert, but they don't feel like an expert.
really tiring.
Really
um,
tiring. Does not apply to me with literally anything at all.
number 3, the natural genius. In this imposter syndrome type, you may feel like a fraud simply because you don't believe that you're naturally intelligent or competent. If you don't get something right the first time around, or it takes you longer to master a skill, you feel like an imposter.
Yeah, which is funny because the heading, the natural genius, is like then followed by the absolute kind of reverse articulation of that. Because I was like, I want to be the natural genius, don't we all?
Yeah.
Like that's what I want to be. But then I was like, oh no, I don't. I don't want to feel that. But anyway, that was not my one.
number 4 number 4 is the soloist. It's also possible to feel like an imposter if you've had to ask for help to reach a certain level or status. Since you couldn't get there on your own, you question your competence or ability. This one really made me pause because I think about um, particularly for anyone who has been in receipt of like affirmative action or like targeted interventions in the workplace where um I even think back to an assessment center where there were 10% of women interviewing for this thing that I was going for, and they ended up with a 50-50 split of men and women, and I at that time was like, do I deserve to be here because they've just gender targeted the quota? So I think that might be an example of that. And I'm sure there are other, for people who belong to other minorities as well, I'm sure that also might feel compounded. Was I promoted because of tokenism or those sorts of
Yeah.
things? And the last one, which I think you and I will probably gas over, is the super person. This type of imposter syndrome involves believing that you must be the hardest worker or reach the highest levels of achievement possible. And if you don't, you're a fraud. Do you want to unpack that one,
Yeah.
Annie? You left a little
Yeah.
highlight in the comment, so I feel like you've got feelings.
Highlight and comment saying, Annie, this one is me. Yeah, I definitely like in the past, but also to an extent now, have like felt this need to sort of prove that I can work like so hard, that I can kind of work as hard as anyone else, and that yeah, from quite early in my career, I think it's been like hard work is directly proportional to success, and I will prove that. And
100%.
like the older I get, the more I think like that is, of course, like not necessarily true. I do believe in like working hard for the things that you want, but I wouldn't say that I see them as like linear at all. Like a lot of success is luck and timing. But definitely like when I look back on earlier feelings of imposter syndrome, it was absolutely driven by like that feeling of I'm going somewhere, I'm working so hard, I'm working so hard, I'm working so hard, and like that. Um, that sort of should be rewarded by this like very quick progression, this very quick achievement. And then, you know, when that didn't happen, or it didn't happen as I expected, then there was probably like feelings of imposter syndrome, or it like, or that hard work wasn't being recognized, I think, in the way that I expected, because I thought this like linear, you know, work and achievement line existed and that I was on it. And sometimes like the feelings of imposter syndrome would come when I was like, sorry, is anyone seeing what I'm doing? Like, can you see? Like, why is no one noticing? And actually, you know, in being a very hard worker, and I'm sure that you've had this, sometimes you are very under the radar because you are executing and delivering so consistently that people just start to sort of rely on you, which is really good, but they're not always like, you don't always recognize your superstars. Sometimes you're just like, yeah, she's so efficient, you know, whatever. And I think there's like an interesting thing that I can see with other people that I work with that happens to the like hard worker, high achiever, where actually it almost becomes implicit that they're valuable and they're good, and therefore they get less praise, and therefore they get less feedback, and that
Definitely.
this cycle of imposter syndrome, because they believe that like,
And
you
then you
know,
get starved of it and you're like, I'm hungry for the compliments. Give me
yeah,
them
yeah,
back.
exactly. And then you can, and I've definitely seen this happen with these like high achieving personality types, then you can get resentment, because like actually I'm burning the midnight oil here. I'm doing everything I can. I think I'm so consistent. I'm working so hard all the time. Why is no one saying well done? And actually, in closed rooms, they're all saying, you know, they're great. They're really consistent. Yeah, give that project to her. Like, she'll be fine. Give that to them. Give that to him. But actually, because you just don't feel it, and then you can get resentful quite quickly because you're just working so hard on this, with this belief that like hard work and achievement are completely linear.
Yeah, I think you're so bang on. It's almost like it doesn't need to be said because it's assumed knowledge that you know that
Yeah.
this is great work, which is so annoying. I've always made a really conscious point, because I've been that person before, of if I ever hear a compliment in a room that a person is not in, to then share that with them after, so that they know
Yeah.
that that conversation is happening and that they're recognized for it. I think for me, for this one in particular, I I think this form of imposter syndrome for me was around on trying to be on the hamster wheel of working hard, getting promotions, trying to make that linear progression, and I was able
Which,
to
to be
do that.
clear, you have done that very successfully. Yes.
I have been able to do that, but what I will say is that the cost of that was that what I was really afraid of, and a bit ashamed of, was my age. So
Mm.
I
Oh,
was
so interesting. So
yeah, that
interesting.
was my like
Yeah.
major insecurity, was like,
Yeah.
I'm leading a team of 55 people and I'm 30, and
Yeah.
a lot of them are older than me, and I feel like I have to demonstrate through extremely hard work that I have earned my position, rather than feeling
Mm.
really comfortable in that. And
Mm.
I think the result of that is just epic burnout. Like, that's not
Yeah. Yeah.
sustainable.
Yeah.
And I think that is actually the root of like when I started setting my boundaries really well, and I changed jobs and I reset kind of most of the foundations, and quite a lot of how I identify in my work around not doing that, because the cost of that was extremely high.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting, as you were saying that. I absolutely felt that when I moved into a corporate, in like quite a senior position, because I had always been in just very small teams where, you know, sometimes I was older than the people I was managing, but often it was similar age and everyone was sort of under 40. Whereas when I moved into a bigger organization, I was really line managing like a huge variation of kind of ages and experiences. And I definitely felt imposter syndrome because of that, but specifically because of my age. But actually, like, you know, bar a few people who definitely did say things like 100%. Interestingly, the people who said things were always women to me. But
Interesting.
But like the experience of managing different ages and different, different people was like so amazing. Like one of the best things to get out of that experience. And the people I was managing, I don't think did treat me like they did. I didn't have to prove anything to them, which was really nice.
Mm.
But yeah, I definitely felt that same feeling when I was the first time I was managing people who were older than me, maybe like had much more career experience than me. Yeah, so that really
Yeah,
relates.
I think also it's when I think you have a big hurdle to get over whenever you first line manage people who are significantly more experienced than you. But it is something that you like really grow into. And I went to a really great training at RADA, which it was a few years ago now, so it's probably changed, but it was for women in leadership, and I'd sort of spoken about it, and they had said that the best thing that you can do is just say, like, I'm not here to control you. I'm not here to demonstrate power over you. I'm actually just here for you to help you to do a better job.
Mm.
And that really helped me at that time. I mean, I just have to have one more anecdote before we continue the
Before we
conversation
get back to it.
about a man who genuinely made me feel very self-conscious about my age. He was probably about 15 years older than me, and he had been one of the project leads of a program that I was brought in to kind of fix because it was all going completely wrong. Um, and I had sort of brought in a new kind of structure for the project and how he would manage it. And he called me and he said, "What you need to understand, Beck, about project management is you can't have two women deliver one baby in 4.5 months." And I was like, Are you speaking to me in the language which I understand, which is my womb?" Like,
That is insane.
I was like,
That's it.
wow, wow, genuinely wow. Um, so
That's what an analogy.
I
Like
know, so patronising in so many
so
different ways.
patronizing.
Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's keep going. I hate to think about that man anymore in my life. So should we talk about the difference between imposter syndrome and general confidence?
Yeah. Yeah. So I wouldn't have been able to answer that before. The thing that really resonated with me was this feeling of shame when you perceive that you don't achieve something or you're in your kind of imposter zone. It's like, it's not just that you don't feel confident that you're about to do something to the ability that you would like to. It's actually that you feel incredibly shameful, sort of regardless of the outcome. Like, and that made me feel very sad actually, because I remember feeling a bit like that sometimes. Why couldn't it have just gone better? Really like shameful. And that's not something I often feel now. Um, but yeah, I think that shame stood out to me as different to the sort of general confidence discussion that we were having. What about you?
Yeah, I think for me it's like a bit more deep rooted than confidence, and I think both of them have crossover. I think both of them uh,
Yeah,
result
definitely.
in quite self-limiting beliefs, and I think
Yeah.
if you think those beliefs are true, you are probably going to hold yourself back in both of them.
And we talked about that in the confidence issue, right? The kind of story you tell yourself. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes.
Yeah, totally. And again, armchair psychologist, I sort of feel like the narrative of imposter syndrome isn't just like the last 5 years. I think it's actually like decades of what you've been telling yourself.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
whereas for me at least, confidence fluctuates a bit more circumstantially. This almost feels like it could be independent of the circumstances. Of kind of what you're going through at work. It's much more deep rooted than that. And I think that's also why it's
Mm.
such a difficult concept to wrap your head around because it is inherently really personal.
Yeah.
And I would expect that everyone has probably a slightly different flavor of the root of their imposter syndrome and
Yeah.
what it means for them. But for me, the really big distinction I think I mentioned earlier is that I think imposter syndrome has so much more to do with societal structure than confidence necessarily. I think confidence has something to do with it, but for me, imposter
Mm,
syndrome is really about the societal context in which you're operating, and what you have been
mm,
conditioned to believe to be true about you
mm,
and the various different aspects of your identity, which I think is a lot heavier than like
mm.
I'm not sure I'm good at my job.
Yeah, agreed. And it's sort of, there's a relativity, isn't there, within imposter syndrome? Like you're comparing yourself to something that maybe you have never even seen, maybe you have seen it, but you are inherently comparing yourself to a true or fictional version of this expert or someone that would do it better or do something to a higher standard. Whereas I feel like confidence, it can cross over into that. It can be relative, but it's not like relative by definition. Whereas this feels like you are comparing yourself to a different standard that you always assume that you have not reached, regardless of what other people's perception are, and sometimes regardless of the feedback that you get. Um, so yeah, I think that's part of it as well. This sort of inherent relativity of imposter syndrome. You're the imposter, and therefore someone else is not an imposter.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating if you think about people who like don't have imposter syndrome. Um, and I like,
Who are they?
well,
Actually, my partner doesn't have it. I can tell you that. Does yours? I bet he doesn't
of
either.
course he doesn't.
Oh,
So
they're
I
the
was thinking about.
worst.
So I like did a bit of reading and I've come up with my own framework. It's no one else's framework. It's probably full of shit, but I'm going to tell you it anyway.
Wait,
Which
sorry,
is
sorry. Are we creating IP here? Intellectual property? Who owns it? Do
like
you own it, or do the career Coven own it as a brand?
I think we can own it as a brand. We can share it.
We're sharing it. Okay,
Um,
nice.
I think actual fraudulent people don't feel like they're imposters. I think they're actually just
Yeah,
like been so effective at being a fraud, like that they don't feel fraudulent. And then
yeah,
I
like
think
that Bitconned, like that Netflix thing, Bitconned. I think it's
well,
called
I
Bitconned.
haven't seen that, but it sounds like I would
Okay.
love it already.
Yeah, yeah, like a real fraudster. Yeah.
Yeah, like Dr. Ruja, if we're talking about Bitcoin.
Ooh, it's like Dr. Reach. Such a kind of quite niche reference that I don't think a lot of people will get, but let's keep it in.
I'm just gonna put a podcast in the show notes if anyone didn't get that reference. It's phenomenal, fascinating
Yeah.
story. She's like top 10 most wanted and presumed dead now. Anyway, I digress. It's a fascinating series. Anyway, the second category, I think, this is not my phrasing. I don't like the phrasing of it. So in our little framework, we're going to
Okay.
have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
rework the names. But
Yeah.
this is people who are, again, not my phrasing, too dumb to realize that they're dumb. Um, which is like,
That is going to need a rephrase.
like let me rephrase this in like more my words. I think there's probably people who over-index on self-confidence or under-index on self-awareness relative to
Yeah.
how they're performing. I think that's how I'd say that diplomatically.
Yeah.
Um, but that is just like they have no idea that they should even feel any level of concern or fear or anxiety about something. And then I think there's just people who have kind of inner confidence that's at the appropriate equilibrium to their performance.
Yeah. Yeah. That's maybe the nicest one.
Yeah.
The
I'd say
yes.
that's where like normal people normal people who are probably successful operate if they don't have imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where both our partners would sit on that one. So it's
Hopefully.
sort of like frauds, idiots, normal.
Yeah.
If we were to sort of shorten it. Anyway, no
Trademark
one's an
that.
idiot. Yeah, yeah, no one's an idiot. I could scratch that from the record. There's no such thing. I don't want to offend anyone. Okay, yeah, yeah, you're right. You're right. So it's pretty. I don't know if I reflect on number three, which is I guess what we kind of aspire to. Um, I don't know many people who are really consistently at like such a clear kind of confidence equilibrium or like just that comfort level. I'm aware that I know a lot of overachievers, right? So I would probably not know that many people that actually have found that balance yet. But I do think it does play back to that, like how common this feeling is. And
Mm.
I personally take like solace or find it reassuring that other people have these feelings too and have to manage them, rather than feeling like isolated and sort of why is this happening to me? And so I do think that, yeah, for anyone who really, really struggles with this, it does feel quite rare to meet people who are at this constant kind of confidence equilibrium. For me, they are certainly the outlier rather than the imposters.
Yeah, and like maybe just also over indexing in white male, wealthy backgrounds.
Yeah,
But
I can only think of privileged white men
I think
that
that's
fit into that
that's the
category,
only area of people I know. That's the only demographic where I can be like, I think that's where they probably hang out.
which really plays into your point about societal structures, right? Really,
Yeah.
really
And
does.
and I also think, we know a lot of overachievers. We know people who work really hard, those sorts of things. I suspect there's also probably a lot of people who would never admit that they feel like an imposter, because that also feels a bit shameful to say it out loud and be like, I feel like I shouldn't be where I am and I don't deserve what I've got. That feels like
Yeah.
a bad thing to say out loud.
Yeah, and it's not a sexy brand. It's not like a I'm confident, I've got it all, I'm smashing it in life, whatever. It's not like the Instagram life or the TikTok brand of like everyone's dreams, right? It's like a personal brand that shows like a lot of vulnerability to kind of say that publicly. And I think that people are getting there, but it's certainly by no means it's by no means easy, and it's by no means common. But yeah, I think there's loads of shame around saying that you feel imposter syndrome. And I actually think it would be very hard for men to
Yes,
say it.
the privileged white men are probably like, well, I definitely can't say that.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, that if the history of the term has also been kind of attached to women, right, that was going to make it even harder for men to actually speak up and say that they're feeling this when we know they are, right? Of course they are. Of course they are. But they are probably taught more how to hide that from a very young age.
What a lovely aspect of masculinity. Um,
Yeah, let's not go down this rabbit hole actually. That's not on topic.
so
Uh,
we were going to talk, and we've spoken about this a bit around the kind of root causes of imposter syndrome, and I've like put in our show like prep notes that this is where I'm going to enter a rant because but when I knew we were doing an episode on imposter syndrome, I had a really strong reaction. I always have a strong reaction to imposter syndrome because what I get unbelievably cross about is just the framing of the entire thing on the individual. And actually, like, if I could rename it and
mm,
reframe it into something that actually reflects what I think is the cause of it, I would feel much happier with it. And I've always said like I hate imposter syndrome. And it's not because I don't recognize people's feelings about it, but I just think the entire framing of it being around the individual is wrong because the root cause is like centuries of oppression, which I'm gonna like try and avoid going into like a really leftist rant. But
mm,
but it is really about like the system, the structure, the narrative, like how we have been brought up since we were children and taught to behave and kind of internalized and absorbed all of those narratives about the conditions of my identity and the different
mm.
aspects of my identity, and therefore that's like a lot of historical legacy oppression that we have been conditioned into, and that has sort of played out manifestly in the workplace with like how much you're paid, what your policies are, and your beliefs and your norms. And like I this is why I get really fucked off about imposter syndrome. It's not that I don't think that people feel it, like people definitely feel it, but I just really don't think it's actually anything to do with the individual. It's on the individual to kind of make themselves feel better and
Mm.
tackle the gender pay gap and all those kinds of things. But it's actually that fixing the symptom isn't fixing the disease. Okay, not a medical term, but
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah,
You get what I mean?
yeah. Yeah, you're like, you could fix all the symptoms. You could fix everyone's imposter syndrome by blaming it on the individual, but you won't tackle the root cause. It will keep coming up. There will keep being generations of people that feel this because unless you fix the kind of systemic root cause issues in society.
There's a really good book which I'll put in the show notes, which is "Fix the System, Not the Women." I think it's by Laura Bates, but I will cut that bit if it's not.
She's my fave. Like, she's my fave. She'll be a chapter in my memoir
Um,
alongside Pret a Manger. Different, different but the same.
what a
That
diverse
level of
memoir! I
admiration.
can't wait.
Yeah, it's gonna be great coming soon.
Um, that's a
Okay
rabbit
though,
over though.
yeah. But being practical, right? If the root causes are at the system, which I totally agree with, how can people like? How do you think people can manage it? Because I think you are right. Like, unfortunately, it is usually up to the individual to manage their own imposter syndrome. So, what do you think you would advise there?
I mean, I would just advise every single person listening to like really examine what are the structures that um, help or disadvantage people that are just really ingrained in the system. And I think one of the places where I've worked previously had really good diversity and inclusion tracking and equity around who's getting pay rises, who's getting promotions,
Hmm.
what are the performance ratings cut by different aspects of a person to make well, just to understand what is going on. But
Yeah,
um like data obviously really helps, but what I try to do, and I spent the last however long 11 years of my career, is at every opportunity that you have to challenge something like that, even if it's on an individual level supporting another individual, but if you
yeah,
can challenge it
agree.
on a wider level, you should, is to, champion people who have been discriminated against and help them fight that case.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of this is around advocacy, and change happens at a groundswell when it's most effective.
yeah,
And I think it's almost the responsibility of everyone at every single opportunity, and at an individual level, that might be me coaching someone to get a promotion when they don't feel like they're ready, and actually being like a bit of a pusher, like Tina Fey in Mean Girls. Um, but, actually being quite assertive about telling people they need to go for those opportunities, and also for telling yourself, like, even if you don't feel ready, you should go it, because actually what you need to do is overcompensate for how many years of oppression and suppression and repression that we've all had. Um, that would be my
yeah,
rallying cry, is like,
yeah.
you have to overcompensate for it. That's what I would say.
Great. You've rallied me for
Great.
sure. And in fact, I think that if you spoke to a lot of successful women of maybe they're like 60, like they're around 60 or late 50s now and have sort of been through the core of their career. I definitely believe that you can still be very successful at that age, but like you've been through, lots of the challenges that people are facing. A lot of them would say get more political, I think, as their advice. Like, because once you see these structures that are potentially kind of reinforcing these systems and reinforcing these problems over and over again, and once you've seen them in many different workplaces, then you realize that, for lack of a better term, the system is fucked and it doesn't really matter where you go. So you have to like make noise about that. And yeah, it certainly does matter on a very individual level, I think. And I certainly try and do the same as you, which is like where I see it, I call it out and, we'll take a very strong line. Um, and I find that quite easy, which is actually a privilege
Yeah,
in many ways to feel like I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to stand for that. But I really understand that that's not easy, and that's not something everyone feels. But
yeah,
definitely, I do think a lot of those kind of more experienced women would say to the younger generation, get political, because that is how it's going to change.
totally. And I feel like so much of the equation around whether you do or don't do that comes with the kind of level of risk that you either objectively have or perceive to have in yourself about the consequences of you taking those actions. So,
Yeah,
like, one of the places where I used to work, I sat on an anti-racism board, and I felt as a white person, it was my duty to be quite forceful about calling out things that were wrong and, you know, policy changes and how we implement them and those sorts of things in a way that um, you know, perhaps if I was a person of color, I might be tarred with a brush of being too aggressive or you know, those other
yeah,
kind of stereotypes that might feel more character damaging. So I think you're right to say that we as white women also have a privilege in being able to do that. But that's also about like intersectional feminism, right? Is that we advocate in the places that we don't necessarily have identities with, but we support everyone through that journey.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, so I think my sort of tips on combating it from my personal, I guess from my personal journey, but I sort of like examined with a therapist, like, what are you actually aiming for? What does that look like? How is it different to what you have today? And I think understanding the role of like luck in success and timing and chance, and really that the world isn't just fair and linear, was another big thing for me of like, oh, okay, so like potentially at any time I could become really successful, but also at any time it could be taken away for various reasons. And it's not just going to be this clear single path for anyone actually. And that has been really helpful for me. It makes me put a lot less pressure on myself.
Yeah, I love that. And also, like, how exhausting to put that much pressure on yourself when we've still got like at least another 3 decades of work. Like,
I know.
I'm tired
Oh my
already.
god.
um,
I honestly do think I look back at like graduate Annie and I do feel a bit sorry for her. I'm like, oh my god, like what were you doing? You should have been doing like more fun stuff. You shouldn't have just been like working in a hotel in Exeter and Devon on a specific thing. Like for your entire 20s. That's what it felt like. That's not true, by the way. But like, I definitely think you're right. Like we've got it's a marathon, this career, not a sprint. And I look back on how much imposter syndrome I probably felt when I was younger and how hard I worked. And don't think it was pointless, but I do think that it was painful. That's what it was. It wasn't pointless, but it was very painful.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I think when I was thinking about this and what I would recommend, actually, we've spoken about this before, but this was back in the confidence episode. But this is around looking for actual evidence objectively about the narrative that you're telling yourself,
Yeah,
and to get to the actual crux of what you're telling yourself, you might have to unpick that layer about 5 times and say, you know, I don't think, for example, now, I don't think I should be a VP. And then you go, why don't you think I should be a VP? And you keep
mm,
asking why until you get to the nub of it. And then when
yeah. The
you
five
realize,
whys.
yeah, when you realize what that is and you say it out loud, you're like, that's a really psychopathic to say about yourself. It's really unkind, but it's also just
Mm,
objectively not true. Um,
mm,
and I think just actually putting your thoughts down on paper or with a friend or with a coach to unpick that and have a moment of really looking at yourself in the mirror about how you're talking to yourself is I think really important. The other
yeah,
thing that I would say that is something to think around this is I think a lot of imposter syndrome when you think about the concept as a whole and that you're fraudulent if you're caught out because you don't know something or you don't have a skill set. I think if you flip that concept, what it's actually about is being really comfortable growing and learning and
yeah,
being really comfortable with the uncertainty in your knowledge or the future of what's going on and just getting really okay with that. And I think we'll also put this in the show notes, but there's loads of literature around growth mindset and fixed mindset, but I
yeah,
do really believe if you can reframe in your mind that like the things that you don't know are actually opportunities to learn, not things to fear,
yeah.
that's really helpful.
I couldn't I just couldn't agree more. And we live in like such a changing world, you know. I would say technology wise, things are changing so quickly at the moment. It's like absolutely unprecedented. And the reason I bring that up is like no one is going to be an expert in this level of change. Like you just couldn't possibly keep
Mm.
up. And as you say, that means having this kind of more growth mindset, like you are unlimited in how much you can learn, and like the opportunities to learn
I just got
is a
quite
much
excited when
less,
you said that. Um,
but there's it's you know it's a much like more calming way to look at what is actually a very possibly destabilizing like climate that we're in. Is like I can learn about this stuff, it's not going to like outsmart me, rather than just like, oh my god, everything is changing so fast in so many ways, in a way that we haven't seen before. How could you possibly keep up as an expert? um and I think we did talk about this, and because I've had some feedback on it, but you know, we talked about the power of like really credibly being able to say like, I don't know, but I'll find that out.
yeah.
And people love that. I got so many messages like, I love that. That actually is really reassuring when someone says that, because they're not lying to you. And so I think tools like that are really good. Even if you're in a presentation and an actual expert asks you a question, you don't have to lie to them and pretend you know. You just say, that's a really good question. I'm going to go and look at that afterwards and I'll come back to you. I don't actually know at the moment, but I'm sure I can find an answer. Great. They think like, great, they didn't lie. They're going to look at that. That's really interesting. And you are not, you know, you're not stupid. You look really smart.
There's nothing
Um,
worse than when someone asks a question and instead of saying that and they obviously don't know the answer, they crap on for like 5 minutes with some waffle, and then everyone's like, "Oh, this is the worst." Just definitely say you don't know it. It's really good. Okay, you had a hot tip for the listeners,
no. No, I don't want to do it. We clipped this out of the other one.
but now I think you have to.
Uh, so I just like do really appreciate like pumping myself up with some music. You know, if I'm feeling nervous, if I'm feeling not confident, maybe if I'm feeling some imposter syndrome, you know, I'll put on some Lizzo. I'll put on some music that is like quite skewed towards kind of dominant, powerful female energy, or as I put in the notes, some bad bitch energy. And
Capitalized BBE.
yeah, yeah, well, it's not big dick energy; it's bad bitch energy. But like, you know what I mean? There are like tactics and ways that you can kind of make yourself feel hyped up and use your nerves as a positive rather
Totally
than a
agree.
negative. And I have found that really helpful. I do find that really helpful still. And it's a bit of a lighter tip. It's not like introspect, go to therapy, examine exactly the way you talk to yourself, which by the way I also did. And as soon as you were saying it, I was like, I remember that session about how I talked to myself, and I remember what a big breakthrough that like 5 whys was in this imposter syndrome era. But then there's also just like, listen to some fucking Lizzo and like, don't worry about it. Like, which
I
which
agree.
may split the crowd. It may split the crowd because it's a real thing and it's usually chronic. But like, there are some like lighter, more practical things that you can do to make it feel less hard day to day and less heavy. And I do find that like music and like stuff that is particularly, in my case, like quite like created to amp up women is
Yeah.
helpful. Um, so that's, now I've done it, and you're not going to let me edit it out, and
I'm
that's
editing the pod. I'm obviously not editing that out. Although, like, I will say, I have the same thing. I think my song. I actually have two songs. One
go
is
on.
Bad Bitch Energy, which is Work Bitch, Britney Spears.
I mean, that's so good.
Um,
It's
and
also like maybe deeply problematic, but also really good.
I know, and I obviously say that like God bless Britney. Her book was
Yeah, yeah,
wild.
okay.
I think that
Wild
lady
and
still needs help, but
of
that
course,
song is a real G up.
yeah.
Um, The other one that I recall, actually, I don't know why, but I specifically like listening to this one in the car, like really loud and singing along,
Okay.
which is
Yeah.
not not necessarily BBE, but
Okay.
Blinding Lights by The Weekend. It's just
Um,
such a banger.
yeah, The Weekend is high on my pump myself up list. Like, um, there is just something about like some of the filth in his songs that I find actually deeply motivating. I'm like, yeah, yes, let's like get this all out on the table. This is smut. It's filth, and I love it.
I mean, there is a problem where like some of the best G Up songs are like hyper problematic.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
but you know, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, and like maybe just pause the little bit of feminist understanding in the lyrics while you're geeing yourself up for your feminist act overall. I'd say like we can take
Exactly.
that.
It's
We
about the
can take that
energy.
from them.
It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's about the energy. It's about absorbing the kind of fuck you energy. Not that in presentations and stuff where we feel imposter syndrome we want to feel like fuck you, but it's like absorbing that energy of like I'm gonna smash it, like this is gonna go well. Or just like a bit of like, I don't care, right? I'm gonna do it. It's gonna be fine because I'm just gonna get it done. And yeah, I think that lots of them are problematic, and that's okay. That's actually not our problem to solve.
No.
I would say it's not our problem to solve. We should take the positives where
Okay.
they are.
Let's move on to the user questions to round us off. So uh, I'm going to start with this one. How would you be confident without being masculine or arrogant?
Yeah. Um, so to your point earlier, lots of the ways that we recognize confidence and confident behaviors are inherently masculine. So this is really hard to like answer without acknowledging that what looks like confident has been defined by male behaviors.
Mm.
So honestly, when I first read this question, I thought I don't give a fuck about being masculine. Like honestly, I don't. Um, but I do respect that many women do not want to come across as that and actually do give a fuck about that. And what I would say is like you've got to kind of, maybe this isn't helpful, but it's what comes to mind, is like you've got to kind of find your style of confidence that is authentic to you. And there are some really amazing people who are very kind of quietly confident. They execute their confidence. They wait for everyone else to speak and then they say like one amazing sentence and like that is their vibe. And that is fine. That is a way to be confident. It might not, it probably isn't like the typical kind of masculine way to be confident, but it can be incredibly impactful. And I think you have to kind of find the style of confidence which works for you. Unfortunately, in very masculine or typical environments, it may be very hard to have a different style of confidence because of confident behaviors being typically masculine behaviors. But then I think you have to influence, as you've talked about on many other episodes, like how you can still be yourself. And if being yourself means retaining a female energy, that's fine. But like still influence and get your outcomes through like a different way. But I would, I guess, encourage this person to think like, what are the behaviors you're labeling as masculine? Are they behaviors that you want to do or not? Are they truly masculine, or are they actually just behaviors that anyone can exhibit? And is that masculine label really helping you get to like where you want to go? Because it's certainly going to like exist in the structure that we're all in, but it's like, is it helping you to label certain behaviors as masculine? Like
Mm.
possibly not. But yeah, everyone's got to find their style. And then with arrogance, you know, I do think arrogance is really different to confidence, you know.
Totally.
And we talked about that a lot in the confidence episode, so I guess I would encourage this person to kind of go back and listen to that. But you know, there are ways to feel, there are ways to be credible and confident and respectful without going anywhere near the kind of arrogant territory. Um,
I would
but I am,
I would just add to that that when I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about like every professional woman who I've met, and if I think about the number of professional women who I think have come across as arrogant, I would literally say it's less than 1%. I'm really struggling to come up with examples. I can think of one person right now, and
Mm.
that's it. And actually, I think the risk of coming across as arrogant, if you're a woman, is probably really quite low.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting.
and I think I genuinely associate arrogance mostly with men. Is what I'm now discovering as I say the sentence out loud. But so I
Well,
think
it's interesting because I don't think it would be as you say, it wouldn't be labeled or recognized as arrogance in women. It would be recognized as something else. So I've definitely worked with someone who I think was a woman and she's incredibly successful and amazing, someone I like really idolize. And I think some people would have labeled her as arrogant, but she was also labeled as like quite introverted, quite shy. You know, she was more of the like few words, high impact than lots of words. Um, and I think that yeah, you're more likely to label certain behaviors like and recognize them as arrogance when they're men. I
mm,
don't know if that's actually helpful, but I can definitely think of one woman, and it's only one in my entire career. So I think that really also echoes your point that I have ever heard someone say, I think she's a bit arrogant. And in all honesty, she was reserved and incredibly beautiful. And I
mm.
think those two things together, like with confidence and frankly exceptionally good at her job as well, those things like swelled up to like, is she a bit arrogant? Like maybe she's a bit dismissive, but like I've actually never heard that leveled against like another woman.
Oh, I just had. I'm not going to talk about it now, but like, there's just a whole separate thing about how attractive someone is in the workplace, which
Yeah, I'm not.
totally
Yeah,
different
yeah,
dimension. But I'm not going to go into it. But I think that's a really interesting point. Um, we've actually already covered this one. The next question was on what role do you think imposter syndrome plays in the gender pay gap? I think it's huge. I think they're both structural issues, and I think every individual um, should just be hunting for more pay if you're on the wrong side of the pay gap, for yourself and in your
obsessed,
policies.
obsessed. Hunting that pay, hunt it down.
Yes,
Yeah,
it.
you know, ask for what you deserve.
Yes. Okay, last question. What can I do to stop imposter syndrome or self doubt when going for a promotion?
I think something that I think you said earlier, but you've certainly written in our notes for this, was that you found like journaling and writing things down like really helpful to kind of break down these beliefs. I think that like really keeping a record of the things you have done, the results, and why you deserve that promotion, and really evidencing it first to yourself can help you not feel imposter syndrome when you are in that room. Like the more evidence and like ammo you bring to a meeting like that, the easier it's going to feel for you because you really have done the work and you're confident in it and you can show it with examples. But also the easier it's going to be to actually like give you the pay rise itself because everything that the person with making that decision needs is kind of there presented by you. So I think really practically I would say like keep that record, have a working doc of like projects that you've done that have gone well, keep it updated every month, just keep track of things where you've like really, you know, had a big impact, shifted an outcome, done a good job, and then take that in, but also read it. Read it yourself, read it regularly, read it every month to tell yourself, like, I'm making progress. Because for everyone, some months don't feel good, but usually you will have done a couple of things in that month that have like moved something, shifted something along, and it can be hard to reflect on that. So I would say kind of write things down, really prep for that meeting. And I don't know if it would I don't know if it would specifically address imposter syndrome, but I think it would address like the actual need of like nail the meeting, get the
Yeah,
money.
yeah, I agree. I mean, that was a way better answer than the answer that I was going to give, which is just I always have a kudos folder in my email. So when people say nice things, I just file them in like a little compliment folder. So when I need a little G up, I go and read nice things
Also
about
good
them.
advice.
Um,
Also good advice.
the other thing,
I think you told me that, and the first time I did that was a few years ago, and actually it was nice. It was nice.
it's lovely to just have a refresher on only compliments. The when you
Specifically, not feedback. It is compliments. It's not feedback. It's a compliments folder. It's not a feedback folder.
no, no one needs to read open feedback if that's not going to make you feel good. The other thing that I would say when going for a promotion, this is advice I give to anyone who I'm line managing, is before you're going for a promotion, I really think you should basically already be acting and delivering at that level so that you feel
Yeah,
really confident going in that. And the way that I manage that with people who I manage is to, at the start of the year, whenever it is for appraisals, set your objectives like the grade above you already are. And if you deliver them, that is like the perfect evidence point of I'm operating at this grade, I should be promoted. And I think it also helps you try on the feeling early of
yeah.
of operating at that level, so that by the time it actually comes to a promotion, I spoke to a friend who's recently gotten a kind of acting position for 6 weeks, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying she was feeling quite nervous about it. And actually, I think trying on the feeling and just seeing what it feels like to act more senior, like no one will even know. You don't
Mm,
have to tell them. You can just, you know, waft around like you're a bit more senior and see what changes and see how you feel. Um, I think that sounds quite fun.
100%. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
That's it. I think that, like, worth saying, this whole episode was kind of structured from user questions themselves. So I hope that we have like managed to answer a lot of those in this kind of rambling. But yeah, thank you for sending us questions. It makes our life a lot easier when you tell us sort of what you want to hear about. And Beck, handing over to you to do the little sign off.
Oh, good. This was actually more fun than I was anticipating it being. It was the funness really overtook how much
Nervous.
imposter I felt about this episode. So,
Yeah.
very good. Loved it. Thanks everyone for listening. We got a random email from like a bot telling us that we ranked really highly in the careers podcast area of Singapore. So thank you to everyone who has been giving us 5 stars and listening to us and sharing with us, because apparently we start rising the ranks we have global listeners everywhere. So if you could do us one favor, it would be to help us find other people who would find this beneficial. So you can do that by giving us 5 stars, sharing with your pals, doing your thing. Okay, bye.
Bye.